Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today I'm talking about some great albums that turned 25 in 2024. There's a bunch of links down below. Make sure you go check them out. There's links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlists I put together every week, and the Patreon page. Make sure you go check all that out. Of course, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. I guess I should preface all this by saying that 1999 does not feel like 25 years ago. It seems like it was just yesterday, but the late 90s was a really interesting time in music. The 90s, there was such a huge transition in music across the entire decade of the 90s. And going into the 2000s, I don't think anyone really knew where music, especially rock music, was going to go. There were still some great albums that were released, though. The first album I got is one that I think really kind of encapsulates a lot of that big shift in music in that time period. So this was released January 12th, 1999. The album is 1459 by Sugar Ray. Sugar Ray is a really interesting band because they had these like big poppy hits, especially off of Floored and off of 1459. But if you go back and listen to those albums, especially Floored is very different than anything else that they had released singles wise off that album. Floored had like a big almost kind of like a new metal kind of feel to some of the tracks on there. It was the first time I listened to it, I was really kind of surprised at the overall feel of that album. 1459, first off, I will say that the title of the album is kind of funny because the band knew that their 15 minutes of fame were pretty much up at this time. There's still some great tracks on here. There's a really great cover of Abracadabra on this album too, and same thing. Like I think I listened to this album. Actually, I think I listened to this album first before I listened to Floored, and I was really surprised when I went back through and dug through those both of those albums, just how different they were from those big singles that they had off both of them. And then on February 23rd, Lit released their second studio album, A Place in the Sun. Of course, My Own Worst Enemy was the big track that was on this album. I think it pushed it up to, I think it was 30 or 31 on the Billboard charts here in the U.S. This is an album that it took me a few years to get around listening to. I want to say it's probably 2003, maybe 2004 when I picked it up on CD. And I was really surprised how much I really enjoyed it. I think I got a used copy for a couple of bucks is why I grabbed it, because I knew the one big track on there. But it's a really solid album. I don't think there's a really skippable track on here. Is it like mind-blowing? No, just a really good, solid album. And surprisingly enough, this album, there's a lot of bands in the early part of the 2000s that listed this album specifically as being a big influence on them, all the way up to like 2005 and 2006. Another big album that was released on February 23rd is the Slim Shady LP by Eminem. Of course, this was the big album for Eminem. It really started his career. It was his second studio album. It was the first album with Aftermath, the first album with Dr. Dre. It's easily one of the most influential rap albums of the last 30 years. So many great albums have been released since then. Go back and look at Eminem as a really big influence on them. And it all goes back to this album. I mean, it's absolutely huge when it was released. This thing would go on to sell over, 10.5 or 11 million copies worldwide. And, still to this day, it's a hugely popular album. Another album that really kind of helped showcase the big transition that rock had made in the late part of the 90s was released on March 8th. That album is Neon Ballroom by Silverchair. Silverchair, their first two albums, I would say, I've never really considered Silverchair a grunge band, but their first two albums are very, especially Frog Stomp, is very, I would say, grunge adjacent maybe. But on this album, they were definitely more experimental, started mixing in a lot of other stuff into their music. Really helped shed that grunge skin that they had as a band overall. And it was interesting because this album really kind of helped propel them to what they would do on their next couple of albums. And, with Diorama and Young Modern. But I think if you go back and listen to Neon Ballroom, as much as I love Frog Stomp and Freak Show, I think Neon Ballroom is probably their most complete album and just a great album from beginning and nothing really skippable on it. Of course, I can't talk about albums released in 1999 without talking about this next one. Released June 1st. Of course, that album is Enema of the State by Blink-182. I'm a huge Blink-182 fan. I have been for a long time. And as much as I loved Dude Ranch when it first came out, I didn't know really what to expect with Enema when it was released. Of course, Scott Raynor left the band after Dude Ranch. They brought in Travis Barker from the Aquabats, which I will say, if you haven't checked out the Aquabats and you're unfamiliar with the band, especially when Travis was with them, go back and check them out. I'm not sure if he actually recorded an album with them or not, but very interesting band. Anyway, this is an album that became hugely influential, and it was really surprising when it was first released how much it was. I mean, it was literally everywhere. People I knew that were not even closely interested in punk music Really love this album. I had this on CD. They were all over MTV, all over TRL. I think it really kind of kicked off that like big TRL punk boom of the early part of the 2000s. It became a really hugely influential album, and one that I kind of go back and forth between this and Dookie as which one I think is the best pop punk album of all time. Speaking of surprising albums, an album that was released a week later on June 8th is one that I didn't really know what to expect before it was released. And I think it's one of the band's best albums now that I've listened to it a bunch of times over the years. But it's Californication by Red Hot Chili Peppers. And I was never a huge Chili Peppers fan. I liked Freaky Styley, some of their like earlier funky kind of stuff. Blood Sugar Sex Magic, of course, is a classic album. But then once John Frusciante left the band, and they brought in Dave Navarro. One Hot Minute was a good album. I don't think it was anywhere close to any of the stuff that they released earlier than that or before that album. And then when John Frusciante rejoined the band for Californication, I expected it to be a good album, but with a big time gap between Blood Sugar Sex Magic and Californication, I didn't know really what to expect. This album's produced by Rick Rubin, which, he's done a bunch of great stuff over the years. I actually think he's done all the Chili Peppers albums I think there's one album that they've released, over the last, 30 years that Rick Rubin wasn't involved in. But, it's an album, this is an album that going back and listen to it, I think it's not as good as Blood Sugar Sex Magic, but I think it's just right behind it as their second best album of all time. Next album is probably the least known album that I'm going to talk about today, and it's one of my favorite live albums of all time. I'd love to see this and get reissued. It's only ever been available as a picture disc, but it was released July 27th. That album is At the Show by MXPX. I love the show. This album. It's one of my favorite live albums of all time. One that I've listened to a bunch of times over the years. I actually went out and picked this up the day it was released on CD. I tracked down a copy of the picture disc a couple years back. It's for picture discs, it sounds okay. It's nothing great. That's why I'd love to see a standard pressing of this get released. But anyway, this was recorded over 2 dates in August of 1998 during the Slowly Going the Way of the Buffalo tour. And it's got a bunch of their best tracks on there from the early part of the band's career. And like I said, just a great live album. One that I'd love to see the band do like some kind of standard release of this year. When the next album was first released, I didn't really know what to expect, so I read a bunch of reviews on it. And I mean, they were really mixed. There was a bunch of great reviews and then some bad ones, and I think a lot of that really kind of colored my opinion of the album early on. It probably took me a little while to check it out, and when I first did, I just didn't understand where the negativity was coming from for this album. Is it his best album? I don't think so, but it's still a really solid album. But this one was released on September 21st. It's Euphoria Morning by Chris Cornell. This is his debut album. This was released between the time he left Soundgarden and he started Audio Slave. It's very different than what he did with Soundgarden. I think it showed a lot of maturity in his career, kind of showed where he could go musically throughout the rest of his solo career. And, going back and listening to this one, I think it's aged really well. It's still a really good album, looking back on it even 25 years later. There's an album that was released on October 26th that was, I think, really kind of flown under the radar, and it really has ever since then. But the album is number 4 by Stone Temple Pilots. So I think what really hurt this album was shortly before this album was released, their lead singer Scott Weiland was arrested, sentenced to a year in jail. And I don't know if the label just didn't push this album the way it pushed other albums because of that, or if it was just because music overall was really changing. But this was an album that really kind of got back to the band's roots. It was more of a straightforward kind of alternative rock album, like Core, like Purple. Tiny Music was a little more experimental than the first two, but with 4, they really kind of got back to what they're good at, and I think it's just as good as the first couple of albums. And then the last album I got on the list is another album that was released on October 26th. And actually, the only one on the list that I don't own a physical copy of. Actually, I think I've got it on CD, but I don't have it on vinyl. Even though it's available, I'd love to get a reissue of it because it goes for several $100 online. But it's the third album from Bush called The Science of Things. And, if you go back and listen to 16 Stone and Razorblade Suitcase, which is Bush's first 2 albums, they're very kind of like straightforward alternative rock with this like grunge kind of aspect to it. With The Science of Things, they kind of evolved their music a little bit more, started implementing a little more some I guess electronic elements into the music, and I think that's what critics really didn't like. Because this album was met with a lot of mixed reviews. I think they were comparing it to their first two albums. And music was, like I said before, music was really shifting in the later part of the '90s, and this is an album that kind of showed that change in music. And I think going back and listening to it, I went probably 15 or more years without listening to this album, and once I went back and checked it out, I think it's a lot better than a lot of the critics give it credit for. And like I said, I'd just love to have a physical copy of it. Well, that's all I got for today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. 1999 was a great year for music. Just an absolute ton of big albums that were released. I'm sure we're going to see a bunch of anniversary box sets and anniversary releases come out over this year. But I just went over 10 of my favorites. There's a bunch more I could have went over. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what your favorite albums from 1999 were and what you'd love to see get reissued this year. But like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me the old thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.